Hi, my name is Nick Stormwood, and I'm going to talk about Dido of Carthage. What do Sakakuya, Pocahontas, and Dido of Carthage have in common? The answer is that all three are women whose stories were retold after the fact by the people that conquered and colonized their people, and their stories were told in such a way that romanticizes the conquerors and smooths over the effects of colonization on a people and their history. In the case of Sacagawea and Pocahontas, we have some of the real facts about their lives because we're not that far separated from the actual events, and thus we can see the lie in the tales told about them by the Americans. However, in the case of Dido of Carthage, all that remains to tell us about this woman are the things told about her by her people's sworn enemies. So the main reference to Dido of Carthage is in Virgil's Aeneid, which is his epic poem that he wrote about the deeds and adventures of Rome's mythological founder, Aeneas, who is supposed to have fled the fall of Troy and gone through several adventures before eventually meeting his fate and establishing Rome in Italy. Dido is mentioned in the Aeneid as something of a side story for Aeneas, a test of his resolve. He and his people are caught in a terrible storm and thrown against the shores of Carthage. Their boats are destroyed. They don't have much by way of supplies. They don't have any money, and they are refugees in a foreign land. So they're in a bad way, and they go to Carthage to ask the mercy of the local ruler, who is of course Dido, the city's founder. And Virgil writes about Dido at first being impressed with Aeneas, but not being necessarily interested in any kind of relationship. But by the machinations of the gods Venus and Juno, the goddess of love and the patron of Carthage, respectively, Dido and Aeneas are contrived to fall in love. This is something that is done to them. They fall in love. Dido offers Aeneas the chance to rule beside her, settle his people in Carthage, and go forward as one people, ruling jointly. And um, and this probably, at least according to Virgil, was probably the way it would have happened. But then Iarbas, a local ruler whom Dido had originally tricked out of the land necessary to build Carthage, decided that it was unfair that Dido had refused his offers of marriage so many times, and yet had fallen for this, vagabond refugee Aeneas. When he Iarbas was this established king with all these riches and things like that. So he complains to his father, who is of course the god Jupiter, and Jupiter has Mercury go down and spur Aeneas on his quest to eventually found Rome. Aeneas, being of course a very pious follower of his gods, um, leaves Dido despite this union that he just made with her, um, and goes on his adventures, ignoring all her attempts to dissuade him, all her pleas, all her even when she asks him to just stay a week so that she can basically get used to the bereavement after being so soon, united. They're about to be separated. He refuses as well. And supposedly, according to Virgil, in her grief over the loss of Aeneas, Dido built an enormous pyre of all the things that reminded her of him, to include all gifts that she gave him and gifts that he gave her. And she ascends this pyre. She makes it look like she's just going to burn all this stuff to basically wash her hands of him, but Then she decides instead to, at the last second before her advisors can stop her, she takes the sword that she gave him as a gift, runs herself through with it, speaks this dying curse upon the people of what would be eventually Rome, saying that her descendants would always be the enemies of Aeneas's descendants, that Carthage would be avenged, that she would be avenged, and that this enmity would have no end. And then she dies on, run through on this sword, and then and self-immolates on this pyre as sort of a big, angry, sarcastic sacrifice to the gods. And Dido appears across European art and literature. Um, that a lot of people were enchanted with this story, the one told in the Aeneid, and um, Dido appears in sculpture, in painting. She appears and she's mentioned multiple times by Shakespeare, and always in this role as this woman scorned who couldn't handle it and killed herself, a victim of the gods, a victim of. Sometimes she's portrayed as a victim of capricious men, but always this is the story that people are telling about Dido. Now, there is another account of her history that is a little bit more, well, for lack of a better term, historical. Um, it isn't. It can't be claimed to be especially accurate because while the Aeneid itself was, essentially one man's fan fiction about the rise of the Roman Empire, this other account given by Junianus Justinian in an epitome that he wrote, or a summary he wrote, it isn't a primary source. It isn't even a secondary or tertiary source. Just Junianus Justinian writes this summary while talking about the works of Gnaeus Pompeius Troilus, who wrote during the time of Virgil. And Gnaeus Pompeius Troilus himself was writing about the lost writings of Timaeus of Tauromenium, who wrote between 356 and 260 BC. And Timaeus's works would have been at least 300 years after the projected death of Dido. Um, so this is it's a reference to a reference to a reference. That being said, it contains a lot of the same details about Dido's life as in the Aeneid. Dido was one of the two children of the king of Tyre, her and her brother Pygmalion. Pygmalion inherited the throne. He murdered her. He murdered Dido's husband because he coveted that man's wealth. Dido eventually found out about the murder, secreted the wealth that Pygmalion had not been able to find, and fled with her attendants and her allies to across the Mediterranean to the coast of Africa, where she tricked a local chieftain and via her cleverness and her boldness, and claimed for her people a hill on which to build a city and build Carthage. However, this other record, this epitome by Junianus Justinian, um, makes no mention of Aeneas. Instead, it says that Dido self-immolated because Iarbas, the Berber king, whom she originally tricked, basically kept pestering her for years to marry him. She refused him multiple times, and then eventually he said he would make war on Carthage if she did not marry him. And so she lied and said she was preparing her to go to her husband, or I guess she bent the truth, and said she was preparing to go to her husband, making him think that she was going to surrender herself to him after essentially a ritual sacrifice. But instead of simply making a ritual sacrifice, she threw herself in the pyre, or impaled herself on her sword, threw herself in the pyre, and self-immolated. Um, and as a result of this sacrifice, she's legendary among the descendants of her people. Um, the ruins of Carthage exist in what is now Tunisia, and the people of Al Tunis, the city built near those ruins that now more or less contains them as a suburb, um, the people of that city, as well as people in Syria and in Lebanon and in Libya, often they all venerate her in some way, though not so much as the people in Tunis who venerate her almost like who in the past have venerated her as a god or a semi-divine figure, sometimes referring to her as Tanit. Um, and and so her legend is very storied, both across Europe and across North Africa, and and yet we only have these two references to her, both of which were written by the people who eradicated the Carthaginians. The Romans fought three separate wars against them, defeated them three times, and the third time they destroyed Carthage. They'd left no stones. It said that they left no two stones standing one on top of the other. They salted the earth. They slew most of the people and enslaved the rest. They committed genocide. And then years later, are writing this. Virgil is writing this account that romanticizes this ancient connection between Rome and Carthage. And part of what makes Dido's story like the story of Pocahontas or Sacagawea is that if you look at the context in which these stories were told, um, it becomes pretty clear why they were told the way they were. Virgil wrote the Aeneid during the rule of Augustus, and Augustus had just been fighting a long and protracted succession war with Mark Antony. Augustus was the heir to Julius Caesar. However, he wasn't the only claimant on the throne, and also Caesar's assassins were running around. And so he first fought a long campaign to destroy the assassins, and eventually fought a long campaign against other rivals to include Mark Antony. And though he came out on top, he did so having he did so during a time of unrest and by committing war crimes. He razed at least one Roman city, which is the sort of thing that creates civil unrest. Um, and in addition, he was solidifying the holdings of some of his rivals that included settlements in North Africa and across the Middle East and around the Mediterranean. And so Virgil's story told around that time, which would have been pretty much how most people heard that history of the region, would have been stories like this told by bards who memorized the entire poem. Virgil's story links Rome's origins to the origins of Carthage and to this heroic figure that the people of North Africa still venerate to this day. Um, it also absolves Rome of the guilt of having committed genocide in North Africa by saying that the reason for the Punic Wars was, in fact, this curse that Dido lay on the descendants of Aeneas, the Romans, as a result of having her heart broken, and that this heartbreak was caused by the gods meddling, not because Aeneas was a bad person. Um, it's a bit of manipulation, isn't it? It also it it also becomes basically the sole historical record that we have of Dido of Carthage, and all of these other references to it throughout history. Even some of the references that you can find if you try to find stories about her written by people from North Africa, you're going to find a lot of references to the Aeneid because it's all that survived. Carthage was destroyed. All of its writings were destroyed. All of its people were destroyed. Um, and so, in some sense, the story of Dido of Carthage highlights the importance of finding the surviving scraps of oral history from people who have been colonized, talking to instead of simply focusing on the reputable works of historians, which in this case will all point back to the same documents, a summary of a summary of a summary, and a piece of fan fiction. It There's probably more to the story of Dido of Carthage to be found out there. But to do it, there's going to need to be some historians that learn Maghrebi Arabic or Levantine dialect and go to Tunisia or go to Lebanon or go to Libya and sit down and talk to people, because the story of the woman Elissa or Elissar, that these people, that her descendants in Altunis and elsewhere venerate, that story does not exist in reputable historical sources. Um, and if we want a history other than the which has been written by the colonizers, then we have to consider alternative sources.